Thank you, Nick. As you've been seeing all morning, and as you'll see in this panel, the reason that the Aspen Strategy Group is unusual is that it does bring together an unusually high level of participant, and it is genuinely nonpartisan. The discussions this summer, as every summer, for someone like me, a journalist, give just an extraordinary chance to listen to what really matters, the questions that are going to drive our world going forward, and to hear the smartest people in our country in foreign policy talk about them. So it's a special pleasure to be here with Susan Rice and Steve Hadley, both former national security advisors, both part of what I sometimes call the great chain of being in national security policy, handed from thoughtful leader to thoughtful leader through the years. So I thought we might begin by asking if each of you were to write a memo at year end, at the end of this year turned upside down, to take the title of our session this summer. Write a memo to your successor, HR McMaster, looking at where we are, where we've come through this first year of the Trump presidency, and where we're going. What would be the bullet points in that memo to HR McMaster? Susan?
Thank you, David. Well, I think I'd begin with a little bit of humility, recognizing, as Steve and I do, that it's a tough job that HR McMaster has, and arguably more difficult in the current context than even Steve and I faced. I would say several things. First of all, I would encourage him to do his utmost, as I imagine he's trying to do, but in particularly difficult contexts, to effect a higher degree of message discipline within the administration. I think one of the challenges we have seen is we have different members of the senior leadership team at different times saying quite divergent things on very important and sensitive issues. That's not only a function of the president and his tweeting that sometimes seems divorced from what I believe has been considered policy, but also even within the cabinet, at times we hear different things, for example, from the UN ambassador than we hear from perhaps the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. And I think that in a time when our leadership is being questioned, and when our stability and consistency is being questioned, having greater message discipline would be very helpful. Secondly, I would encourage General McMaster to work with Secretary Tillerson and others in the administration to staff up the State Department with urgency, and to cease efforts to reduce the budget by 30%, and to reassure our career diplomats that, in fact, the work they do is valued and necessary. I think we have a huge crisis of confidence within the State Department, which is not a short-term problem, but with the exodus at the senior ranks and the lack of recruits at the junior ranks, I fear we are facing a generational deficit. And it is one that undermines our efficacy across every region of the world. I would also urge General McMaster to give very careful thought, apropos of the conversation that we were just having on North Korea, to the public assertion that there is a viable military solution to the problem in North Korea, for all the reasons that were just discussed previously. I fear that while publicly no administration should take any option off the table, that we are boxing ourselves into a narrower set of options on a very complex problem that could leave us in a corner where we don't want to be, and where the outcomes can only be counterproductive. And then finally, and I think the list could go on, but I would also encourage a renewed effort in 2018 to reinforce and reinvigorate our alliances, our traditional alliances in Europe, also our relationships in Asia. I think, we're in different places with different allies, but each of them at different times has been buffeted by ambiguity, if not downright confusion, as to the constancy of our commitment. And I think in this very difficult and uncertain time, that is not helpful to any number of our larger objectives. So let me stop there and let Steve answer the same question.
Steve, bullet points for HR.
So I would start by telling him that he's doing some things right. When you're in those jobs, everybody's telling you you're doing things wrong. So it's nice to sort of start out by saying you're doing something right. And so I would probably phrase it, you've set the table pretty well on some policies. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I've spent some time in Asia. People are feeling pretty good. They feel he's sort of connected pretty well with our traditional allies in the Middle East. He certainly has a good relationship with Japan. A lot of the concerns people had from the rhetoric in the election have been mitigated because the policies actually adopted have strayed considerably from some of that rhetoric. So I'd start by saying, you've set the table pretty well for a set of policies and strategies. Now you've got to put the food on it and then eat the meal. And they will start doing that with their national security strategy. I think I would probably say that the perception from the outside is that the process is not working as smoothly as it needs to at any level. It doesn't seem to have gotten into kind of a battle rhythm. And that's, of course, an issue for the National Security Advisor. It's really an issue for the President. And, they don't seem to be working together as a team in a coordinated way, particularly at the senior level yet. And that's worrisome. I would say to them that one of the things they need to figure out is roles and responsibilities. So this sounds a little silly, and it may be wrong. I need to say, I was not part of the Trump campaign for the transition or the administration, and I've never met President Trump. So, you can decide how much weight to give on what I'm about to say. But this is a man who's now president of the United States, who's never been in government at any level for a single day. And he doesn't know how it works. He knows how real estate works. And I think there's a problem of figuring out, helping the president understand what his role is, what he needs to do, and what he needs other people to do, and getting some kind of roles and responsibilities clarified. Everybody seems to be tromping a little bit over each other, and that's not going to work effectively. I guess another thing I would say is that there is a military cast to their policies, and yet some of the people who are former military who were in cabinet-level positions know very well from their own experience that the problems we have with terrorism, the problems we have in the Middle East, cannot be solved by military means alone. And my worry is that I have not seen them rolling out the kinds of integrated strategies that you need that capitalize on the progress that we've made in Iraq and in Syria against ISIS to break basically the caliphate and exclude those forces. You now need to come in behind with a set of policies that help those victimized communities reestablish good governance, economic prosperity, and security. And, people say there shouldn't be any nation building. We're not nation building. Those people need to build themselves, but they need help, and it's in our interest to give them that help, because if we don't, there will not be long-term stability. And if there's not long-term stability, we'll be back with ISIS 2.0. So I would say, I think they are not giving evidence to have developed the kind of full set of strategies integrating political, economic, security, and military to achieve stability in some of these areas. And that's an important thing that needs to be done.
One big theme of this world turned upside down, in my judgment, has been the rise, really the validation of the rise of China as a global power. That was symbolized in Xi Jinping's extraordinary performance at the party plenum, which was promptly followed by President Trump's visit to Beijing, which seem to me to be an American validation of this new Chinese role. Yeah, and I want to ask each of you to reflect on China and the United States. And Susan, let me ask you to begin that. President Trump's disruptive style, putting people on edge, was on display during the transition when he mentioned, had a phone call with the leader of Taiwan, worrying the Chinese. But that's been followed by an extraordinary embrace. If I strung together all the nice things Donald Trump has said about Xi Jinping, it would go on for pages. And in particular, the administration seems to have decided that China is the key to successful outcomes with North Korea. So I'd ask you to assess that judgment, that a good relationship with China is essential, that it's best to get at that by disrupting them, threatening them with trade sanctions, et cetera, but then this extraordinary embrace in the last few months.
Well, David, I think the challenge is as follows. First of all, in my estimation, the bilateral relationship with China is the most consequential that we have in the world. It's also one of the most complex and difficult because we have a mix of competition and the potential, and indeed in some instances, the reality of cooperation. And I think what we've seen from the Trump administration is a sort of pivoting to extremes. On the one hand, as you mentioned, he came in during the transition putting not just China, but many on edge with his statements on Taiwan that suggested a radical recalibration of our historic balancing of Taiwan and China, and also some very hot rhetoric about the potential for a trade war. And now, particularly culminating in his visit in November, we've seen a pivot to, as you said, an extraordinarily warm embrace of Xi Jinping, with, as you said, more accolades for Xi than almost any other leader, with the possible exception of Vladimir Putin. And yet, Xi is governing in a very iron-handed way. We have said nothing at all publicly about human rights or the rule of law. We've said very little about our very real economic concerns and the necessity of protecting our intellectual property and our industries that are under threat. And so I think what we need to do is strike a balance, not one extreme, not the other. China is a country with which we must find avenues for cooperation where our interests overlap, and we have done so in the past on everything from nuclear security to pandemic disease, and not to mention climate change. But we also have to recognize that China's interests and ours substantially diverge, and we are competitors in many important realms, from the Asia-Pacific region broadly and the South China Sea to various other areas. And we can't fawn over China. We can't brush under the rug its nefarious practices. On the other hand, we can't create a mortal enemy where we needn't have one. And so that balance is one that I think we have to strike, and I think we haven't quite found our footing there. North Korea, obviously, is a very important issue with which we have to work with China, but I think we have to be realistic. Yes, China has the capacity to continue to tighten the economic screws on North Korea, and we have seen it incrementally do so over the years, including in recent months. We want to encourage that. We want to be able to continue to work with China to ratchet up the pressure in the United Nations, as that remains a necessity, but also to have a productive dialogue with China about future scenarios that might unfold on the Korean Peninsula, so that we are not surprising one another. But to expect China to go as far as we might like it to go, to put the sort of regime-threatening, destabilizing pressure on North Korea that American administrations have sought for many years, I think has been and is increasingly unrealistic to expect will be manifest by China. And so we can't expect it to solve this problem for us. It is a country with which we must work on the problem of North Korea, but with realism and a recognition that China's interests and ours, while they converge on the goal of denuclearization, do not converge on the means of achieving it in every instance.
Steve, what's your judgment? Is the Trump administration being too accommodating and optimistic about what this China risen, that's the way I'd describe it, can do to help the United States to frame an order in the world that's congenial for us?
I think we're all not really appreciating the magnitude of what China represents. You know, people said there are people who emphasize the competitive aspects. I think Susan's right. There are competitive and cooperative aspects. Or people who emphasize the competitive aspects say, well, you know, we have another global rival, you know, like the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union had great military power, but was fairly weak in economic and in terms of influence. China is a formidable competitor. And when we talk about the change and the disruption of the international order we've had since World War II, one of the big factors is the reemergence of great power competition, and China is at the forefront of that. And in some sense, it's not just China. We're actually seeing emerging or have emerged two major new world powers, China and India. So it becomes a very complicated geometry. But I think China's significance is enormous. One Belt, One Road initiative that you've talked about it is probably, in my view, the most remarkable strategic initiative so far in this century. It's basically saying to the United States and others, you think you can box me in on my Pacific coast? Well, I've got an inland, land-based access route that's going to take me all the way to Europe. And I'm going to build infrastructure, and I'm going to get support for those countries. If you look at the impact the Chinese economy has had in Southeast Asia, the extent to which countries are dependent on China, and that they are using that to begin to influence the politics of these countries, that's what's potentially ahead when you look west as China builds out its infrastructure. So this is an enormous challenge for the United States, for the international order. And I think to manage it, it's going to take us all working together. I was very troubled by the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, not just because of the economic significance of it, but from the strategic significance. It looks like we're not playing in the region when we have to do just the opposite. We need to be active in the world, in that part of the region, in every dimension, diplomatic, economic, military, you name it. And we need to not look at it as Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. It's all Asia, and we're going to have to work with Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, all these countries in a coordinated way, not to draw new lines, not to contain China, but to engage China and try to shape its policies, because it is going to have a decisive influence on the region and the world, and it's our job to try and shape it in productive ways and to engage them and to design a revised and adapted international order that is stable, that serves our interests, and preserves as much as we can of the democratic foundations of the existing order. That's really the challenge. So yeah, we have to deal with North Korea and all the rest, but I don't think we really appreciate and have taken into account the magnitude of the challenge we face.
So I want to just note that we're going to be turning to the audience in about 10 minutes for your questions, so please do be thinking of what you'd like to ask Steve Hadley and Susan Rice. I want to turn now to a discussion of a subject that dominates our headlines, our cable news coverage, and that's Russia. And I want to ask you to focus this looking forward and ask Susan to begin. Susan, as I remember President Obama's policies toward Russia after the Crimea invasion, after Ukraine, after Syria, and I would say to some extent after Russian meddling in our election, but you could contest this. I remember the phrase exit ramp. It kept being repeated. We want to leave Vladimir Putin an exit ramp. We want to allow him to stop this policy that's damaging and destructive. And there did seem to be some optimism that given the sanctions we were applying against Russia, that at some point this would just become too costly for Putin, and he would take one of these exit ramps. I haven't seen that. And so I want to ask you, as you look toward 2018, whether you think it's still time to keep those exit ramps open, or whether you, as you look at policy, would think maybe it's time for a different strategic view toward Russia.
Well, let me just clarify how I understood the term exit ramp. And it was initially applied with respect to Ukraine. We had organized the European Union and ourselves and our G7 partners to implement increasingly stringent sanctions on Russia with the aim of trying to get them to roll back their interference and involvement in Ukraine and in Crimea. And we were also engaged with our partners in Europe on an effort to negotiate the Minsk agreements, which France and Germany played a leading role in, and we were very much engaged in, which, if implemented, would have resolved at least the issue of eastern Ukraine in a fashion consistent with international law, consistent with the interests of the sovereign in Kyiv. And we did all that as we were also substantially increasing our support, financial, economic, political, and military, to the government of Ukraine. And the notion was that the pressure and the sanctions were not meant purely to punish or as an end in themselves. They were to create an opportunity for a diplomatic solution to be found. And the off-ramp idea was, you don't close off the opportunity for your policy to succeed. If in the event the pressure you have applied is having the desired impact, you want to be able to capitalize on that with a diplomatic opening. And the same theory applied in the context of Syria. That was not the theory nor the practice in the context of Russian interference in the elections. So I think those are different circumstances. But in the case of Ukraine and in the case of Syria, Russia doubled down on its policies. And I think in recent months, we've seen not the opportunity for them to take an off-ramp, but frankly a superhighway where there's no constraint to what they might do, because not only have we not increased the sanctions, even though Congress mandated that we must, those sanctions have not been forthcoming from the administration. Not only that, but we have talked about rolling back existing sanctions. And we have essentially left the diplomacy, both in Ukraine and to a lesser extent Ukraine, but particularly in Syria, to others. And so I think we are in a place now where the question is, what are our tools to address both the Ukrainian challenge and the Syrian challenge? And you ask a broader question: is it time for a rather radical readjustment to our approach to Russia? I think it's at least time for clarity and understanding across party lines on a national and bipartisan basis that we face a Russia that is pursuing policies that are antithetical to our interests. Russia is not our friend. Putin is not worthy of the Nobel Prize, as has been suggested by some. He is acting in a way that is in violation of international law, in violation of, the norms of humanity, particularly in Syria. And we need to be united and clear in pushing back on that. I think we need to implement the sanctions that Congress has mandated. We need to consider additional sanctions. There are steps we could take which would in fact be more complex than the sanctions we've imposed to date, because they would implicate not only European interests, but in some instances our interests as well. But they would implicate Russia's interests even more. And so we should consider that balance. We need to continue to build up our support for the eastern flank of NATO and not open the door to Russian meddling in NATO through our rhetoric or through any ambiguity about the constancy of our commitment to our NATO allies. And in places like Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East, where Russia is running around arguably, eating our lunch, in places like Egypt, we need to be very clear about where we are with our partners in different regions and make clear that we are not leaving open doors for Russia, whose, as I said, whose interests are manifestly in opposition to ours, to gain advantage at our expense.
Steve, President Trump has been remarkably consistent through the campaign, through all the turmoil that surrounds the question of Russia, in saying he believes that the interests of the United States are served by a better relationship with Russia and with Vladimir Putin, and that you can't solve major problems unless you have that. Is he wrong? And how would you assess the question I put to Susan? Is it time for a change in how we deal with this powerful Russia? I'll just tag on a comment I shared with you before our session. A friend of mine recently said to me, thinking about all these issues, we need to give Russia a punch in the nose. We need to find somewhere in the world and give them a punch in the nose. What do you think about punching in the nose, but more generally about this interesting paradox of Trump's Russia policy?
Well, look, I think we could all agree that an improved relationship with Russia would be a good thing. Russia is active in a lot of theaters. My worry is that Putin, in some senses, decided his role is to be the spoiler in some sense. If the United States is for it, he's against it. If the United States is trying to do something, he'll take the opposite side. Ambassador Kislyak, before he left, at one point said, you Americans have decided that Russia's the enemy, and Putin is going to just start to show you what it's like to have Russia as an enemy. This is not a good place to be in. The question is, can we change Russia behavior so that in a way that is consistent with our terms, so that it can be a partner? We got a long way to go to do that. How do you get there? Well, a couple things, it seems to me, and you see a lot of it in terms of Ukraine and what he's doing in Europe. My view, for what it's worth, is that Putin is not a great strategist, and he's not particularly reckless, but he is a brilliant opportunist, and he sees an opportunity, and he steps in and takes advantage of it. And you saw it in Syria, you see it in other instances. And he'll make a move, and then he will see whether his intervention succeeds and whether he's resisted. And if it starts to flounder, and if he is resisted, he pull back. If he's not resisted, he will up his objectives. We saw that in Georgia. I think we've seen it elsewhere. What do you need to do? You need to do two things. One, you need to take things off the table, deny him opportunities. That's what we're trying to do, for example, in the Baltic states and in Central and Eastern Europe. We are trying to strengthen NATO's presence, to put troops on the ground, to make it clear that the Baltic states are off the table. The Balkans are off the table. They are not going to be an opportunity for Putin to do what he did in Ukraine. Second of all, where he does act, I don't know whether it's punch him in the nose, but you need to act in such a way so that he pays tactically and cannot achieve his tactical objectives, and see that he's actually been strategically defeated. His aspirations in Ukraine, I think, were much more ambitious in terms of basically taking a large swath of that country on the eastern side and have it very much pro-Russian. he's now got, Donetsk and Luhansk. And he is paying a price in terms of sanctions, in terms of isolation. At some point, it will come time to test and see whether he's willing to have a settlement of Ukraine to reduce an investment and do it on terms that are acceptable to the Ukrainians and acceptable to the rest of us. I don't know. We ought to test that proposition, and if it is not available, and if it is not an option, then we need to increase sanctions, and we need to do things like arming the Ukrainians with lethal weapons. This guy is going to be a problem, and he needs to be engaged on each of these kinds of scenarios, and I think it's a combination of hardening opportunities so he cannot make mischief, and then confronting him when he does act. Finally, the thing we still have not figured out is the campaign he is using to sow division within our societies. You see it here in the United States, you see it in Europe. We have not figured out how to counter that in any way, and we are not doing it effectively. And this is part of the ideological struggle. We have now Xi Jinping in China who says his authoritarian state capitalism is an alternative to the Western democratic free market model, and Putin certainly seems to believe the same thing. And they are actively trying to convince the world that theirs is a superior model, and we're on our back foot. We are not responding in a sensible way.
Before I turn this to the audience for your questions, I want to ask one last question of my own. And I want to pull the camera back, if you will, to the basic question that we were struggling with last August in Aspen. I think it's fair to say that every member of the group grew up in the shadow of the world that was created after World War II. And the idea of American power that was embodied in the work of President Truman, of George Marshall, of the liberal American order, liberal international order, as we describe it. And so I want to ask, as a final question, how lasting each of you think the damage to that order is, and what are the best ways to defend that broad idea? Susan, maybe you could start. Do you think is the damage here going to be lasting, or will this sort of revert to its previous shape after this period of tumult and the presidency of Donald Trump?
Well, I think we have to distinguish between the various forces pulling at the liberal world order. Some of them might be considered predominantly exogenous, coming from outside, and we considered a number of those in Aspen: the direction of Europe, the rise of China, the new economy, Russia's role. And each of those has a origin and a momentum of its own, which I think we need to be very realistic about. I think Steve's point about how significant this risen China is a very valid one, but I don't think it represents a mortal threat to the United States if we manage it carefully. Then there are the endogenous origins or causes of the fraying of the liberal world order, and those are things that I would argue come from within ourselves as the principal leader and creator of this liberal world order. And these things are relatively new. These are shocks that have been added to the exogenous factors. And I think we can work to manage and temper and accommodate and limit the exogenous aspects of this. But obviously we have the greatest control theoretically over the endogenous aspects of this. And I don't know that we have fully grasped the significance of what I would term the abdication of American leadership internationally, which we have seen take on new forms as we walk out of agreements that we ourselves committed to, whether it's Paris or TPP, or put in jeopardy Iran deal, or now take decisions on things like Jerusalem, which leave us substantially isolated internationally. There are many different ways in which we have ceded the stage and left a vacuum of American leadership, which only accelerates the opportunity of China and others to fill the void. But we also have our own domestic internal divisions, which are so debilitating, which facilitate the kinds of disruptive efforts that the Russians engaged in during and arguably since the election. When we ourselves are so polarized and unable to agree even on the facts that we're debating, much less on where we are going, we are threatening our own ability to come back. And so the answer to your question, I think, if we were playing with all of our cards on the table with a degree of national unity and strength and clarity of our role as a leader in the world, I think these exogenous challenges can be managed. And we can see the evolution of the liberal world order. It won't be identical to what it was in 45 or 90, but it can be a 21st century version that substantially upholds our interests and our values. But if we don't get our domestic house in order and decide what kind of leader we want to be and do it from a position of national unity, then I think a lot of bets may be off.
Steve, you always say to me in our conversations that we need to remember that this president is an insurgent. And I've grown to understand, think about that point. So with that in mind, let me just ask you directly, is the old order finished? Is it over? And if it's possible that that's so, what might be coming to replace it?
Well, you know, there will always be an order of some sort. That is to say, there will be relationships among states. The question is whether it will be like the order we've had since the end of World War II, which is basically the creation of the United States and our allies, based on democratic principles and open economies. And it's been, you know, very successful, not just for the United States, but for the world in terms of providing an unprecedented period of prosperity and security. The alternative to that is a different kind of order. You could have and it's one of the answers to the question you put to Susan. It is not fated that that order will fade away, but it depends on our policies. If we try to exclude and not adapt that order to the changes we have seen, it is more likely to fade away. If we do not embrace China and try to incorporate China in an effort to adapt that international order by, for example, not standing aside when they create the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, we should have embraced it. We should have been part of it. We should have tried to use our influence as part of it to make sure it met international standards of transparency and accountability and helping those who received funds, and integrated it into the international order. We should be doing the same thing with the One Belt, One Road. If we do that, I think China would be preferred to be inside at the table adapting the existing order, and we can preserve it. If, on the other hand, we do not, and we try to stiff on China, the risk is that China, Russia, and others will form, in some sense, an alternative international order based on authoritarian principles, not on win-win, but zero-sum and competition. And that, I think, potentially becomes a safe haven for all the bad actors of the world who want to get out from under the international order that makes them subject, for example, to things like sanctions. A space for, you know, the North Koreans and the Iranians and the money launderers and the terrorists, an alternative structure, if you will, which will not be the place any of us would want to live, and will be competitive with the international order that we've seen. So I think it depends on our policies. And one of the things I would add to the memo to McMaster is Everybody thinks because you've withdrawn from certain agreements, you are withdrawing from the world. I don't think that is their intention. And they have to come up with an explanation of a theory of engagement that they can sell to the American people. Last point. One of the things we made at the Aspen Strategy Group, we can say all we want about reconstituting and adapting the international order, but it has also lost the support of the American people. And there is a group of people who gave expression in this last election who feel victimized by globalization, threatened by immigration, abandoned by their political leaders, and betrayed by people like us. And those people are the ones who really say the international order should go away. We've got to address their grievances. There are ways to do that. I wish we had had a tax cut that really helped the middle class, an infrastructure program that would give people in their 50s and 60s who only have 20th century skills jobs, and then a real job training to adapt to the new economy. Put a ribbon around that. I think you could have gotten bipartisan support for it. We've got to address those grievances to make people comfortable, to continue to be a platform and supportive of American engagement in the world, and then we need to adapt this international order. But we've got to address, as Susan said, we've got to address the exogenous factors and the endogenous factors. Whatever, the ones involve our domestic politics. We've got to do both, or we're not going to save this international order.
So let's turn to the members of the audience. If they have questions, please identify yourself. Ode. And just identify yourself, Ode.
Aberdeen, Capital Trust Group. What advice would you give President Trump on the Middle East and on Jerusalem?
I think it's a little late on Jerusalem. So I think they're off to a pretty good start. They've embraced our traditional allies, both Arab and, of course, Israel as well, and made it clear we're on their side and we have their back. I think that's a good thing. They've focused effort and built on what was done in the Obama administration to go after ISIS. We've had great success in Iraq and Syria. I think that's good. A lot of rhetoric about checking Iran, a lot more rhetoric than reality. And the problem of what Iran in the region is, I think, a relatively unaddressed problem that we haven't really got a strategy for. So I think they're off to a fairly good start. And I think the other thing we really need to do is, Madeline and I did a study and talked about a lot of bottom-up activity in terms of young people and women who are forming businesses and forming social organizations. We need to be supporting them, and we need to support those governments that view them as allies in building a better future for their people. And you see that in places like Tunisia. You see it in terms of UAE. You see it in what the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia is trying to do with his country and for his country, Vision 2030. We should be supporting those efforts. Madeline and I, in the study we did for Atlantic Council, we came away actually optimistic in the sense that there are things to work with in the Middle East that offer the prospect of a more peaceful and prosperous Middle East. We've got to help them wind down these civil wars, and then we've got to support those governments that are making positive steps to reform their economies and engage their people in developing a common future. We do those things and have a little luck. The Middle East over time can turn in a positive direction.
Susan, any thoughts about Jerusalem or the larger question of Middle East policy?
Yeah, I would say the following as to where we need to be going. I think, first of all, I'll address the broader Middle East in the first instance. It would be folly to upend the Iran deal, which is working and has created a degree of stability. We ought to sustain it and not threaten its viability, because we will be the ones isolated. The Iranians will be the ones free to pursue a program unfettered, and we will be isolated from our European allies. Secondly, I would say we need to continue and not take our eye off the ball of sustaining the gains that we have made against ISIS. I think we're much better, generally speaking, at executing military campaigns than we are with dealing with the post-conflict political and economic and social reconstruction. I think Steve's point earlier about staying engaged in Iraq and Syria and building behind the military victory so that we don't see ISIS 2.0 is absolutely vital. And it's not clear to me that we have a theory of what the post-conflict outcome will be in Syria. I would also suggest that with respect to the peace process or potential peace process, that the move in Jerusalem is, while it may be done, was not helpful, obviously. If the aim was, in fact, to put on the table a peace plan that results in the potential for a two-state outcome, I think what it has done is to make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for the Palestinians to approach the proposal with anything like a positive attitude. And maybe that was the point. But if it wasn't, I think it's had the inadvertent or the consequence of making that effort more remote. And then finally, and here Steve and I may take a different point of view, I think we definitely need to continue and sustain our efforts, if not intensify them, to counter Iran's nefarious activities in the region, but not with absolute blind carte blanche support for the Saudis and their partners in the region, because I think we have underestimated the ability of the young Saudi crown prince to engage in behavior outside of his borders that is detrimental not only to our interests, but ultimately, in my estimation, to Saudi interests. I think we are risking exacerbating the fissures, the Sunni Shia fissures in the region by our unqualified and untempered amen choir for everything that comes out of Riyadh, including its very destructive policies in Yemen. And so I think we need to make clear to our good friends and partners in Saudi and the Gulf that we share their concerns about security and the threat that Iran poses in the region, but there is a smart way and a dangerous way to deal with that, in a way that may make ultimately the Iranian problem more dangerous over time, even if it gives us some short-term sense of gratification. And we need to be a little bit smarter about how we calibrate our support, because I think it is over-torqued at the moment.
We have time for one more quick question if there are any hands. I'm not seeing any. So let me turn this back to our director, Nick Burns. This conversation makes me look forward to next summer in Aspen and reporting back to you after that.